I've been testing the Canon EOS R5 with firmware 1.6 all weekend. Some claim they can record unlimited 8K or even 4K 120, 4K 60, and even 8K oversampled 4K. Can the R5 record unlimited video? Has the biggest barrier to this camera been erased? The results are better than I expected. Details coming up, but first I encourage you to subscribe and choose all notifications so you're kept informed on the latest camera gear, news, and rumors, as well as insightful videos like this. When I reported on the huge firmware update last week to 5 Canon mirrorless cameras, I didn't have time to test claims of unlimited recording. I wanted to get the news out to you. And after all, this isn't the first firmware to allow unlimited recording on the Canon EOS R5 in 8K RAW, 8K oversampled 4K, 4K 120, and 4K 60. When I published a video about the firmware updates for the 5 Canon cameras, the R3, R5, R6, R7, and R10, I told you I was going to spend a lot of time testing it. And this weekend, I was testing the camera day in and day out, both Saturday and Sunday, spent an awful lot of time testing the overheat modes. And I want to tell you a little bit about the testing environment that I used. I didn't test outside where it was 80, 90, 90 plus degrees because the weather was all over the place. We had thunderstorms. We had temperature variations that at one point would be 90 degrees. And then when a thunderstorm came through, it dropped it all the way down to 70 degrees. And at some point down to 66 degrees. We also had hail. And the reason why I didn't want to test in that environment is I couldn't keep the temperature steady. I wanted to test in an environment where I could say, okay, we didn't have any overheating at this temperature or below. So what I did for the first test is I tested in my studio. The temperature is 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I tested with the LCD out. And let me just verify all the other settings I had. I tested with an Angelbird 2 terabyte CF Express card, the Mark II, that has a minimum sustained write speed of 1300 megabytes per second. In some tests, I tested with a 2 terabyte. In other tests, I tested with a 1 terabyte. I tested on a tripod. The camera was about 3 feet above the ground. And I'd say at that level, we're looking at about 70 degrees. It was a little cooler, closer to the ground. And of course, it's on a tripod. It's using a quick release plate. Anything else that I've mentioned or forgot to mention? The standby low res setting is defaulted to on. So for part of the test, I tested with the batteries. And well, I'm going to tell you why I switched over to the mains shortly thereafter, because, well, I was going through an awful lot of batteries. The first test I tested was 8K RAW at 30 frames per second. Not 24, not 25, but 30 frames per second. That gives us a standard bit rate of around 325 megabytes per second. In bits, that's around 2600 megabits per second. And I was really staggered here. I had my Canon 70D shooting the screen, so the resolution here isn't very good, but you can see it kept going and going and going. Essentially, I filled up the 2 terabyte card. It took about 1 hour and 8 or 10 minutes. I can't remember the exact amount, but it shot for over an hour, filled up the card, a 2 terabyte CF Express card. No sign of overheating. We didn't get any icon indicating that it was about ready to overheat or it was going to shut down. It kept on going. Now the camera was hot to the touch and the CF Express cards were pretty hot too, but not so much that I burnt myself. And if you leave them in the camera for about 10, 30 seconds, well, they're going to cool off to the point where they're going to be a whole lot cooler. The Angelbird CF Express cards, they do cool off pretty quickly. At 70 degrees Fahrenheit, we're able to record unlimited 8K RAW at 30 frames per second. Now, this is significant because in most studio environments, the temperature is anywhere from around 64 degrees up to about 74 degrees. So 64 to 74 degrees is your standard studio temperatures. So to be able to shoot unlimited 8K RAW inside the Canon EOS R5 is absolutely amazing. However, you are limited to your storage. I was using a 2 terabyte CF Express card by Angelbird, the Mark IIs, and I really wish I could put the 4 terabyte in there. Now, I haven't tested the 4 terabyte in this camera yet, but up until recently, Canon doesn't support GPT partition tables. Once they do, we'll be able to use 4 terabyte CF Express cards and get about 2.5 hours of 8K RAW video in this camera. So I really do hope we do get support for GPT partition tables. Maybe in a future firmware update, Canon, maybe in a future firmware update, you can give us support for GPT partition tables. All right, so the 8K RAW test at 30 frames per second wasn't actually my first test. And I wasn't starting with a camera completely cold. It had about 30 minutes to rest, but the previous test was actually 4K 120. Now, I tested this in a slightly warmer environment. I was just actually playing around with the camera. This is where I was starting to play around, look to see what was different in the camera, look through the menus, and start playing around with this overheat mode. So what I did is I turned the camera on, I set it to 4K, 120 frames per second, so you have to enable that high frame rate, and I could shoot for 7.5 minutes, and then of course it would stop recording because I'd hit that time limit. Why 7.5 minutes and not 30? Well, 7.5 minutes times 4, which is the slow motion based on 30 frames per second at 120 frames per second, gives us 30 minutes or 29:59. So after that, I got ready to press record again, only this time what I noticed, it said I only had about 3.5 minutes left. So I went into the menu system, and that setting again is called Auto Power Temp, and by default, it's set to standard. Well, I went ahead and set it to high. And of course, immediately it showed me 7.5 minutes. So I pressed record, no problem. After recording for 7.5 minutes, it stopped recording, and I went ahead and pressed record again, and I was able to record for another 7.5 minutes. Again, this is at 75 degrees. The fourth time around, I went ahead and pressed record again, only this time it said I only had about 6 minutes left, something less than 7.5 minutes. Take a look right here. You notice this, there's our overheat warning. Now keep in mind, this is 4K at 120 frames per second. We've already shot for just over 23, 24 minutes, and then we get this showing up. But wait, there's something else that shows up. You see that? That red flashing temperature. It's letting you know that pretty soon the camera's going to go ahead and shut off due to overheat. And what I really like about this firmware update is no longer do we have that flashing overheat warning, which we have no idea when the camera's going to shut off. Once we see that white flashing overheat warning, we know that we can still keep recording. If you're doing an interview, you can find the right place to stop until, of course, you see that red. If you see that red, you really do want to stop so that you don't risk damaging any of your content or having corrupt files. You can record up to that red flashing thing. So that's something really interesting to know. I did watch a lot of videos this week, and I did some research, so I wanted to test my findings against others, and I have yet to see anybody else talk about when those overheat warnings came up. Now, I also want to talk to you a little about the camera that I'm using. It's a Canon EOS R5 that I purchased on July the 30th, 2020. I'm not aware that Canon has made any updates to their cameras, so I'm assuming it's the exact same camera model as the previous ones that have been sold. However, I've seen this with technology, with computers. You can have the exact same model, but for equipment that, well, keeps selling for year after year, sometimes they shrink internal components or remove components to reduce costs. But what is certainly different is this camera isn't new anymore. I've been shooting with it almost every day for 2 years. On this channel, I have about 800 videos that I've published, and a good 600 of those videos have been done with a Canon EOS R5. And there's other videos I've done with my own, for my own personal use for clients. So here's the thing. I don't know if I've slightly worn down the camera, or if it's capable of less or more. These are just a certain given data points where I've been able to test 8K RAW, unlimited, at 30 frames per second based on an ambient temperature of 70 degrees. And 4K at 120 at 75 degrees, I was able to record a total of around 26 minutes. But now you might be wondering about those other two modes, 4K 60, as well as the 8K oversample 4K, otherwise known as 4K HQ, also otherwise known as 4K Fine. And this is where we're getting the full sensor readout of the sensor, 45 megapixels. Again, I'm shooting on a tripod. I'm shooting with a Canon EOS R5. There's no Ninja 5. I haven't used a Ninja 5 at any time in this video. And I'm shooting with the Angelbird 1TB card this time, the CF Express MK2, with a minimum sustained write speed of 1300 megabytes per second. What else have I failed to mention here? Yes, oversample, Angelbird card. Oh yes, 30 frames per second. Autofocus is on, and autofocus was on in every mode here. And I'm shooting all eye. There is no RAW option for 8K oversampled 4K. All right, so this is really, really interesting. Again, at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, no sign of any overheating at all, and I went for 2.5 hours. After 2.5 hours, I decided to stop. No overheat warning, not even that white one. No sign of it in any way whatsoever. But one thing I did notice, while the camera didn't seem to be any noticeably hotter than testing in 8K or even 4K 120, the CF Express card was very, very hot. In fact, it was so hot, I could only hold on to it for about 5 seconds before I had to put it down. And when I looked at my finger, I could see a slight scorching of my fingernails. And even afterwards, if you've ever burnt your finger, and I'm not talking badly burned it, but just enough, it kind of feels a little, like the skin feels a little bit, I don't know, stiff afterwards. That's kind of how it felt. Now, after about half an hour, it completely went away, but the CF Express cards are definitely running a whole lot hotter. I wish I had one of those temperature guns so I could let you know the exact temperature. But yeah, definitely when I did the 8K oversample 4K, definitely running hot. But again, at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, there was no sign of overheating in any way whatsoever. But the one thing that really became very much apparent is how many times I had to get up, go ahead and press the record button again because it hit that 30-minute record limit. That 30-minute record limit just stands out now as something crying to be fixed, like the R7, the R10, the R3. Come on, Canon. I love what you've done in this firmware update. You've given a lot of people a lot more options of recording video. Now let's release the reins. Let's take off that 30-minute record limit in a future firmware update, along with that GPT partition table support, unless of course you've hidden it in this firmware update and I've yet to notice. So yeah, I would love to see those changes. Also, one other thing too, I did reach out to Angelbird and ask them if they've tested out firmware 1.6 for a couple of reasons to see if they noticed the GPT partition table removed, because while I was talking to them, I'm busy testing the camera and I've only got one Canon EOS R5. But also I wanted to know if the high temperature being reported in these modes without overheating with this new setting, if that could potentially cause a problem, if that pushes it above the temperature range for this card, if it could risk shortening the life of it. And they said they're definitely going to get back to me on that. But as the firmware update only recently came out, it's probably going to take time for their development and testing teams to get in and test this. They're probably testing who knows what other goodies they're working on. All right, and now for 4K 60. So 4K, 8K oversample 4K, I was able to run for 2.5 hours without any sign of overheating whatsoever. And you'll be happy to know that 4K 60, I was able to do the same. I stopped testing at 2.5 hours, but I did make a slight mistake with this one. You see, after recording for a total of 2 hours, I forgot to press record. Now, what I do after I press record, every time I go back to the computer, I take down my notes, I take measurements, and usually I press record. And this time I thought to myself, did I press record and it shut off? Well, I took the CF Express card out of the camera, put it into the computer, and no, I hadn't pressed record a third time. So I put it back in the camera, and that took me about 2.5 minutes, and I started recording again. But I went 2.5 hours. I initially planned to do it for 2 hours, but I wanted to go longer. Again, there was absolutely no sign of overheating any way whatsoever. At 70 degrees Fahrenheit, recording at 4K 60, all I, just really incredible. So I'd like to sum up briefly here that when it comes to the overheat modes of 8K oversample 4K, 8K RAW, 30 frames per second, 4K 60, 4K, well, let's leave 4K 120 out, but for all three of those modes, I didn't discover any overheating in any way whatsoever. And to me, I really think the 2-hour mark is a very significant marker. And here's why. To get to 2 hours, you're going to go through multiple batteries. You're going to be on your third battery, at least in 8K RAW. At 4K 60 and 8K oversample 4K, the battery power, well, it lasted a whole lot longer, but you're going to be running through batteries like crazy unless you're powered from the mains, which is what I switched over to later on because I just ran out of batteries. I have 6 of them, and I went through them pretty quickly. And also, I was only testing in a studio environment at around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and 70 degrees Fahrenheit is a little bit on the high side for studios. My studio down here, for example, often is anywhere from 64 degrees to 68 degrees, and in the winter, it can actually drop down to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty cold. I think that's somewhere around 15 or 14 degrees Celsius. Wow. Wow is a big deal. We can now record unlimited in most modes without having to worry about overheating in a studio environment. But what you might be wondering if you're living in Malaysia, if you're living in Kentucky, Atlanta, Florida, or pretty well anywhere in Europe right now is what happens if the temperature is north of 80 degrees or 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And I really want to test that. I'm going to test that over the next couple of weeks. It's a whole lot harder to test at 80 and 90 degrees unless I turn the heat on in this house and bring the temperature up to 80 or 90 degrees. And even still with the temperature hot outside, unless I then turn the air conditioning back on, it's going to be almost impossible to keep the internal temperature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the right day where it's really, really hot. There's no threat of rain or thunderstorms. I'll provide somewhat of a protected environment so the sun isn't beating down. I just want to deal with the ambient temperature of somewhere between 80 and 90 degrees. And I'm going to redo all these tests starting with 8K RAW at 30 frames per second. then do the 8K oversample 4K. I'll do a separate video on each one because I'm probably only going to have a window of 2 or 3 hours on any given day to shoot this, and probably the best time when it's at the hottest is between 2 and 4 o'clock. So that's the best time for me to record. So keep an eye out for other videos coming out. To be able to record unlimited, remember we have that setting, and I always keep forgetting the name of the setting. I get it mixed up with a few of the other settings. It's called Auto Power Off Temp. And we have standard, and of course we have the high. If you want to be able to do that essentially unlimited recording in those modes that I just talked about, you're going to want to set it to high. And here's a potential problem. As I mentioned, the CF Express card was very hot to the touch. It slightly burned me. It is very, very hot, but it's also cooking the internals of the camera. And you can't go against material science. And what happens is, especially if you're starting off on a cold day and you're going from around 0 and you're jacking that all the way up to 100 and you're doing that consistently day after day, you're going from cold, you're heating everything up, dropping it down, heating it up, dropping it down consistently. What that's doing is causing wear and tear on the materials used, on the circuit boards, on the components. And over time, you're essentially reducing the life of your camera, of your storage as well. At least that's the risk, and it makes an awful lot of sense from what we know of material sciences. However, it's taken 2 years for Canon to come out with this firmware update. They could have done it right at the very beginning when they released firmware 1.1.0. But what I think was going on at Canon is they were concerned. They didn't want to have a worse fiasco than they were currently dealing with, so they improved the algorithm to address ambient temperature. So if you did actually put it in a fridge, you did record, you could record for longer than a couple of minutes, or 7.5 minutes in 4K 120, or 30 minutes in 8K oversampled 4K. So that lasted us for the last couple of years. And what they've probably done behind the scenes is they've been testing this fix for the last 2.5 years, because the last thing Canon wanted to do is make this overheat situation worse, where it started damaging the cameras and they would have to, well, have them repaired or fixed, or worse, face a recall, because this is something that would most likely lead to some sort of court litigation, class action, and like Apple has had to do before, they were kind of forced into doing a recall because, well, it just didn't look good in the press. I don't have any data on this yet, but considering Canon's been shooting for a couple of years, and I'm sure they've been testing this for a long time, I wouldn't be too concerned about it, but I'm going to have to wait and see the results of testing at 80 degrees and 90 degrees Fahrenheit to see what the results are there. But yes, things are definitely hotter. And for me, the way I'm shooting right now, and I just did a test earlier this morning, I'm back to standard mode. What I really like now is, even though I'm shooting in standard mode because I want to protect the camera, I want it to last me an awful long time, and I want to have a good resale value for it, I'm going to shoot in standard mode. But if I'm out doing run and gun stuff, or let's say I was in Europe on vacation right now facing 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, and I was at the Louvre or someplace and it was flashing overheat, I could switch over to that high mode, get the shots I needed, and not have to worry about, crap, we got to go inside for half an hour to let this thing cool down before we can go out and get our shot. And of course, you know as well as I do, if you wait for moments to happen, they don't. You've missed the moment. It's not going to happen again. And that's the sad fact of shooting video. You just can't get that moment back. So I'm really happy that this is there. For me personally, I'm going to keep it in the standard mode, but it's really nice to know that it has that overheat. So over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be producing videos exploring this firmware a whole lot more in detail. I did want to have a video out a little sooner. I know some of you said to me, Simon, why can't you test this overheat? Why don't you think the R5's firmware update 1.6 is a big deal? And I simply said to several of the comments, I haven't had a chance to test it. I can't speak from a position of, well, no authority. And so this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, I shot for a long time. I shot with a 2 terabyte card, a 1 terabyte card. I've never, ever before filled up a 2 terabyte card with a Canon EOS R5 shooting 8K RAW. And I haven't had any weird functionality. That the Canon didn't act in a weird way. The R5 seemed fine after I let it cool down. And a lot of times when I shot the 8K oversample 4K video, and I only let the camera cool down for 30 minutes. And when I started doing the 4K 60 recording, and this is rather significant, the camera is still relatively warm. Not hot, but warm enough that I know it hadn't had a full cool down. And yet I was able to do 2.5 hours of 4K 60, so I think that's rather significant. So if you want to watch my latest videos on firmware 1.6, testing out the Canon EOS R5, at 80 degrees and 90 degrees, or if you want to stay up to date on my latest camera news and rumor videos, go ahead and subscribe, but please make sure you choose all notifications. By choosing all notifications down at the bottom of the screen, what that does is has YouTube notify you of when I come out with a new video. So that way you can stay up to date on the latest camera news and rumors, or the latest firmware, or the implications of the latest firmware update for the Canon EOS R5 Firmware 1.6. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.